The wind howled through the dense trees, a rustling sound that carried a sense of something ancient. But it wasn't the wind that caught Alex's attention. It was the sharp, hungry eyes of a wolf, watching him from the shadows. Alex's heart raced not out of fear but out of a strange, unexplainable sense of connection. The creature, lit only by the fading light of the sun, seemed to pulse with a quiet power, its gaze unyielding. Alex, though confined to a wheelchair, had never let his disability define him. The wilderness, with its wild beauty, had always been his escape, a place where the limitations of his body faded into the backdrop of towering pines and rustling leaves. He'd never felt as free as when he was sitting by the window of his family's cabin, sketching the animals that moved through the forest. From the birds fluttering above the trees to the deer that grazed in the meadow, Alex's art was his lifeline to the world outside, a world that, for him, seemed unreachable. He had been in that wheelchair for 2 years now, ever since the accident. He didn't talk about it much, his parents didn't either, but the pain of losing his ability to walk was something that haunted him daily. Yet, when he looked out into the wilderness, when he saw the way the animals moved freely, unburdened by anything but the rhythm of the earth, Alex felt something stir inside him, a deep yearning, a desire to be part of that world. And now, as the wolf's eyes locked with his, he felt that longing intensify. There was no fear, no panic, only a strange calmness, an understanding, perhaps, that ran deeper than words. The wolf's gaze wasn't one of malice. It was a gaze that seemed to know him, to know his pain, and perhaps to recognize something in him that Alex had yet to discover about himself. Alex sat still, his breath caught in his throat. For a moment, the world around him seemed to disappear. The trees, the wind, even the soft crunch of the gravel beneath his wheels, everything faded into the background. It was just him and the wolf. Then, with a sudden shift, the wolf's gaze broke. It turned, slipping back into the forest, disappearing into the darkening shadows. Alex blinked, his hand instinctively reaching for his sketchbook. His fingers trembled as he flipped open the worn pages, his pencil moving quickly across the paper. The image of the wolf, its eyes, its fur, was already burned into his memory, and he knew he had to capture it before the vision faded. The wind, still howling in the trees, seemed to echo the rhythm of his heart. The next day, Alex couldn't stop thinking about the wolf. It lingered in his thoughts, a shadow moving at the edges of his mind. His fingers still ached from the frantic sketching the night before. The image of those intelligent eyes, so full of untold stories, was etched into every line of his notebook. He knew he had to tell someone, but he hesitated. Who would believe him? At breakfast, Alex couldn't help but mention it. "I saw the wolf again," he said casually, pushing his cereal around in his bowl, avoiding his mother's gaze. His mother paused, the spoon halfway to her mouth. "A wolf," she smiled softly, trying to hide the concern in her eyes. "Alex, I'm sure it was just a trick of the light. There are no wolves around here." Alex's father, who'd been quietly reading the newspaper, looked up. "Wolves haven't been seen in these parts in years, kiddo," he said, a slight frown creasing his brow. "It was probably just a coyote or some other animal. Nothing to worry about." But Alex knew what he'd seen. He wasn't imagining it. The wolf had been real. More than that, it had felt different. Almost like it had been waiting for him, waiting for something he couldn't quite understand. Despite his parents' dismissive responses, Alex couldn't shake the feeling. He didn't care if they believed him or not. Something deep inside him told him that he was meant to find the wolf again. He had to see it with his own eyes to understand whatever strange connection was pulling him toward it. That afternoon, after his parents left the cabin to gather supplies in town, Alex decided to venture into the forest alone. The wind, carrying the scent of pine and earth, seemed to whisper to him, urging him forward. As he wheeled himself along the familiar dirt path that led into the heart of the wilderness, the familiar sounds of nature, birds chirping, leaves rustling, brought a sense of peace, yet also a quiet unease. He was so focused on the path ahead that he didn't notice the change in the air. The forest seemed quieter now, the sounds of nature muffled as if holding its breath. And then, from the corner of his eye, he saw it. The wolf. It stood at the edge of the clearing, its massive frame barely visible in the shadows of the trees. Its fur was darker now, almost blending in with the nightfall, but its eyes, those deep, penetrating eyes, shone out in the dusk like twin embers. For a moment neither of them moved. Alex's heart raced, but the fear was gone. The wolf wasn't a threat. It wasn't running away either, as most animals would. It simply stood there, watching him with an intensity that made Alex feel as if it was waiting for him to make the next move. Slowly, Alex wheeled forward, the wheels of his chair crunching over the dirt path. The wolf's gaze never wavered. It didn't growl or snarl. It simply observed, as if testing him, as if trying to gauge whether he was friend or foe. Alex reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out his sketchbook and a pencil, his fingers trembling slightly as he opened to a blank page. Without thinking, he began to sketch the wolf's form, its striking features, the curve of its powerful muscles, the sharpness of its eyes. He felt a pull toward the creature, as if they shared an unspoken understanding. For what felt like hours, they stood there, Alex in his wheelchair, the wolf just beyond the trees, locked in a silent exchange. Finally, Alex looked up from his drawing, meeting the wolf's gaze one last time, and then, without a sound, the wolf turned and disappeared into the forest. Alex sat still for a long moment, feeling the weight of the encounter settle into his chest. The forest was alive with sounds again, the wind, the birds, the rustle of leaves, but it felt different now. He wasn't alone in the wilderness anymore. He had found the wolf, and somehow he knew the wolf had found him too. The next morning, Alex couldn't stop thinking about the wolf. His sketchbook was filled with the creature's form, its eyes, its power, each drawing a silent testament to their strange connection. But as much as he wanted to share it with someone, especially with his parents, doubt lingered in his mind. They wouldn't understand. They never had. When Alex showed his parents his latest sketches at breakfast, his mother's brow furrowed in concern. "Alex, honey, we've talked about this. Wild animals are dangerous. Wolves, especially." She paused, searching for the right words. "They're not like the animals you draw. They're not pets." "I know, Mom," Alex said quietly, pushing his cereal around. "I'm not saying I want to go pet one. I feel like there's something different about this one. It's not like the others. It's not dangerous. He stopped, himself feeling the weight of his words. How could he explain a connection so deep, so inexplicable? How could he make them understand? His father, as usual, was more pragmatic. "Wild animals are unpredictable. You need to be careful, son. You can't just wander off into the woods by yourself, especially with your condition." His voice was firm, yet laced with worry. "I know you love the outdoors, but you can't be reckless. This isn't some fairy tale." The words stung, even though Alex knew they were coming from a place of love. But he wasn't reckless. He just needed to understand. The wolf had been there, waiting for him. It wasn't some figment of his imagination. It was real, and so was the bond he felt. That night, sleep came fitfully. Alex's dreams were filled with the wolf once more. But this time, it wasn't standing at the edge of the forest, watching. No, it was moving through the trees, leading him, guiding him. Alex could feel its presence beside him, as if it were walking just ahead, waiting for him to follow. It wasn't chasing him, it was leading him, gently urging him to come deeper into the forest. A hidden glade, a place untouched by time, was just beyond the thicket. Alex could almost see it, a peaceful haven bathed in soft moonlight. He tried to follow, his legs struggling to move as they once had. But he was in his wheelchair, and his body betrayed him as always. He couldn't keep up with the wolf. He couldn't reach that place. Alex woke with a start, the sensation of the wolf's presence still hanging in the air. His body was damp. With sweat, his heart pounding in his chest. The image of the hidden glade lingered, a haunting beauty that felt just out of reach. He was awake now, but the feeling, the need to find the place the wolf had shown him, hadn't gone. It had only grown stronger. He lay in his bed for a while, staring at the ceiling, trying to calm his racing thoughts. The wolf wasn't a threat. It had never shown any signs of aggression. But his parents, they wouldn't understand that. All they saw was a wild animal, something to fear. And yet Alex knew. He felt it in his bones. The wolf wasn't there to harm him. It was something else, a guide, a messenger, maybe even a teacher. The night was quiet now, the only sound the rustling of the trees outside his window. The wind had died down, and everything was still. But inside Alex's chest, the storm raged on, a storm of uncertainty, of longing, and of a fear he couldn't quite name. He didn't know if it was the fear of the wolf or the fear of what it meant. But one thing was clear, he couldn't let this go. The wolf had shown him something, and Alex needed to see it through. The forest was quieter than usual when Alex decided to venture out again. His parents had left for the day, their voices fading as they drove down the long dirt road toward town. They had warned him not to go too far, not to overexert himself. But Alex couldn't stay in the cabin any longer. He had to go back to the woods to find the wolf once more. This time, Alex had no doubts. He didn't feel the sting of his parents' concerns pressing down on him. He didn't feel the uncertainty that had clouded his mind the past few days. As his wheelchair bumped over the uneven terrain, Alex felt a quiet, steady resolve settle in his chest. The wolf was real. It was out, there, and it wanted him to follow. With each turn of the wheel, the trees grew taller around him. The shadows seemed darker, the air thicker, as if the forest itself was drawing him deeper, calling him in. Alex could feel the familiar pull again, the same sense of connection he'd felt that first time. It wasn't fear that tugged at him. Now it was something else, a deeper, more instinctual understanding that he wasn't meant to be afraid. He didn't know how he knew, but he did. The deeper Alex went, the more he felt the presence of the wolf. It was as if the very forest had come alive around him, whispering its secrets in the wind, guiding him forward. He had no map, no plan, only the wolf's silent invitation. And then, there it was. It appeared from the shadows, its massive form emerging from the trees like a phantom. The wolf's fur was darker than the night itself, and its eyes, those eyes, burned with a quiet intensity. It didn't approach him with the same caution as before. This time, the wolf came closer, its pace deliberate, its head slightly lowered. As if it were inviting Alex to step closer, Alex stopped, his breath catching in his throat, his heart pounded, but not out of fear. The wolf wasn't a threat, it was a companion, a guide. Slowly, Alex extended his hand, palm up, just as his father had once shown him when approaching animals. At first, the wolf hesitated, its nostrils flaring as it sniffed the air. For a moment, it seemed uncertain. Then, as if making a decision, it stepped closer, its eyes locked on Alex's with a curious gaze. Alex held his breath, afraid to move, afraid to break the moment. The wolf stopped just out of reach, its powerful body tensed, but not aggressive. Alex could feel the energy between them, a quiet electric bond that seemed to hum in the air. The wolf's gaze softened, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. Time seemed to stretch, the world shrinking down to just them, the boy in his wheelchair and the wild creature standing before him. And then, as if it had been waiting for this moment, the wolf sniffed again, taking a small step forward. Alex didn't pull back. He didn't need to. He knew deep down that this was what the wolf wanted, to trust him, to show him that they were no longer strangers. The wolf's fur brushed against Alex's outstretched hand, the warm, soft touch, sending a rush of emotion through him. It was a fleeting moment, but it felt like a lifetime. The connection between them, unspoken yet undeniable, made Alex's heart swell with something he couldn't quite put into words. For a long time, they stayed there, Alex, his hand hovering just above the wolf's back, and the wolf standing tall, its eyes glowing in the twilight. And in that moment, Alex knew the wolf wasn't just a wild animal. It wasn't just an elusive, untamable force of nature. It was a teacher, a guide, a companion. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, the wolf slowly backed away, disappearing once more into the shadows of the trees. Alex didn't move. He stayed where he was, his heart still racing, his mind overwhelmed with the enormity of what had just happened. But even as the wolf vanished from sight, Alex knew that this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The days that followed were quieter, yet filled with a sense of anticipation that Alex could never shake. It wasn't the kind of anticipation that makes the heart race with excitement or fear, but the kind that stirs something deeper, more primal, like the quiet hum of a distant storm on the horizon. Every time Alex wheeled himself out of the cabin, his eyes were drawn to the edge of the trees, where shadows shifted and the wind carried the softest whispers. The wolf was out there somewhere, watching. Each day it returned. Sometimes Alex saw it from a distance, its form just visible among the trees. Other times it seemed to follow him, just out of sight but always present. And then there were the days when it would come closer, so close, in fact, that Alex could feel the heat of its presence even without seeing it. The wolf would stay. In the shadows, just enough to remain hidden, but always within reach. And then, on the fourth day, the wolf came closer than ever before. Alex had been out for a long while, exploring the trails he knew so well, drawing inspiration for his sketches. The wheelchair's wheels groaned as they rolled over the uneven earth, and the sound of birds and rustling leaves filled the air. But all of it faded when he felt it, the unmistakable weight of the wolf's gaze upon him. He looked to the trees, half expecting to see those haunting amber eyes staring back at him. But no, this time the wolf stepped from the shadows, its large frame moving with quiet grace through the underbrush. Alex stopped. His heart thrummed in his chest, but this time it wasn't fear. It was something else, a strange peace mixed with the weight of something deep, something unspoken. The wolf was close now. So close that Alex could hear the faint sound of its breath, the soft shuffle of its paws against the ground. It didn't make a sound, didn't growl, didn't show any sign of aggression. It just stood there, its dark fur glistening in the soft light that filtered through the trees. Its eyes, those eyes, were focused on Alex with an intensity that spoke of something ancient, something wise. For a moment, neither of them moved. Alex's hand hovered near the notebook in his lap, his fingers trembling. He could feel the wolf's presence in a way that was both comforting and overwhelming. It was like the air between them thickened, charged with an energy that he couldn't explain. Without thinking, Alex reached for his sketchbook. The pencil in his hand moved instinctively, as if guided by the same force that brought him here. In the first place, he didn't try to capture the details. He couldn't. No drawing could capture the essence of what he was feeling in this moment. Instead, he drew lines, broad strokes of dark and light, capturing the very weight of the wolf's presence, the powerful energy that radiated from it. The wolf watched, its gaze unwavering. And in that moment, Alex realized something he hadn't. Before, the wolf wasn't just observing him, it was learning him. Just as Alex had been watching it, studying its movements, its grace, the wolf had been doing the same. There was a shared understanding between them now, something that went beyond words. They had come to an unspoken agreement. The wolf wasn't here just for Alex. It wasn't some wild animal that wandered into his life by chance. It had been watching him too, just as he had watched it. It had been waiting for something. And now, in the stillness of the forest, in the space between the breaths of both boy and beast, that something was happening. Alex finished the sketch and looked up. The wolf was still there, its head tilted slightly, as if contemplating his work. There was no fear, no hesitation, only a quiet, mutual recognition. And then, as silently as it had appeared, the wolf turned and melted back into the shadows, leaving Alex alone in the quiet of the forest, his heart still racing but with a sense of peace that he couldn't quite put into words. For the first time in days, Alex felt a deep sense of connection, not just with the wolf, but with the wilderness itself. The bond between them had been forged, not in words, not in actions, but in the space between them. The forest, the wolf, and Alex were one. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor, Alex wheeled, himself back toward the cabin. His hands gripped the wheels tightly, but his mind was elsewhere, filled with the weight of what had just transpired. He wasn't alone. He never had been. The wolf was out there, and it was watching over him, just as he had been watching over it. And somehow, in that quiet understanding, Alex knew he wasn't just a boy in a wheelchair anymore. He was part of something much bigger, something wild and free. The morning light had barely touched the treetops when Alex made his decision. The wolf had been watching him, had been guiding him through the wild. It had been leading him towards something. There was no doubt in his mind anymore. He had to follow. He wheeled himself to the edge of the forest, his eyes scanning the trees for any sign of the wolf. He could feel it, deep within his bones. Today was different. Today, the wolf would show him something important. As the wheels of his chair crunched over the dry leaves and pine needles, the forest seemed quieter, as if it was holding its breath. The usual sounds, the chirping of birds, the rustling of small creatures in the underbrush, faded away. The world around Alex narrowed down to just the path ahead, to the deep, endless green that stretched before him. And then, there it was. The wolf appeared, stepping from the shadows, its body sleek and dark against the backdrop of the towering trees. It didn't hesitate this time. It moved with purpose, its eyes never leaving Alex's. But it wasn't just a silent watcher anymore. It was a guide, a silent companion, urging Alex forward with each step. Alex's heart pounded in his chest as he wheeled closer, but he didn't feel fear. Not now. He knew with certainty that the wolf wanted him to follow. And so, he did. The woods seemed to open before him, the path unfolding like an invitation. For what felt like hours, they moved together, Alex in his chair and the wolf just ahead. The forest was dense here, the trees thick and ancient, their roots twisting. In the earth, like the hands of forgotten gods. The air was thick with the scent of moss and pine, the smell of earth, of life, and of something older, more eternal. The wolf led him deeper, past familiar trails, into places Alex had never been. The trees grew closer together, their branches interlocking high above, blocking out the sunlight and casting everything into shadow. The ground became uneven, the terrain more difficult to navigate. Alex's hands burned as he gripped the wheels of his chair, his arms straining with each push, but he didn't stop. The wolf's presence was a steady pull, a force that seemed to lift him forward, and then they arrived. The clearing opened up before them, bathed in the pale light of the late morning. The air was different here, thicker, more alive. Alex could feel the weight of something ancient in the space, a sense of reverence in the way the trees stood, silent sentinels around the clearing. The ground was soft with moss and ferns, a lush green carpet that seemed to hum with life. In the center of the clearing, Alex saw something that took his breath away. A wolf's den. Not just any den, but a place of refuge, a sanctuary. The walls were made of stones and fallen branches, carefully placed almost as if they had been arranged by hands, not paws. And inside, nestled within the cool shadows of the den, were the wolves, the pack. Alex's heart raced as he looked around. The wolves weren't just watching him, they were watching him with a deep, knowing gaze. There were no growls, no signs of aggression, just a quiet, steady presence. The pack seemed to accept him, as if they had been waiting for him too. The wolf that had led him here stood by his side, its eyes never leaving Alex's. It was clear now. The wolf was not just any wild animal, it was a protector, a guardian of the wild of this place. And it had chosen Alex, but there was something else, something deeper in the air, something Alex hadn't fully understood until now. The forest was changing. The world was changing. The wolves were struggling. The den, the sanctuary, wasn't just a place of safety, it was a last refuge. The pack was small, fewer in number than Alex had imagined. Their fur was matted, their eyes weary. The balance of the wild had been disturbed, and it wasn't just the wolves who felt it. Alex could sense it now, the way the very air seemed to thrum with tension. The forest, once vibrant, was beginning to show signs of wear. Fewer animals, less food, a deeper quiet in the trees. Something was threatening the wilderness. Alex's heart tightened. He had seen it in the wolf's eyes, the sense of desperation, of urgency. This was why the wolf had come to him. This was why the wolf had been leading him on this journey. It was showing him the truth, the fragility of the world he loved so deeply. In the silence of the clearing, Alex finally understood. The wolf wasn't just teaching him about survival. It was teaching him about resilience, about the fight to protect the things we love. The wolf's pack wasn't just struggling to survive. They were struggling to protect the wilderness, to keep the balance intact. And that struggle, that fight, was far from over. The wolf's gaze softened as it watched Alex. It was asking him something now, something that went beyond just understanding. It was asking him to help, to be part of something greater than himself. Alex looked down at his sketchbook, now clutched tightly in his lap. He had come here to draw, to capture the wolf's beauty, its wildness. But now it wasn't just the wolf he needed to capture. It was the message, the urgency, the call to protect, and with a deep, steady breath, Alex began to draw, not just the wolf, but the forest, the pack, the quiet urgency that hung in the air. He wasn't sure if he fully understood what was at stake yet, but he knew one thing for certain: this journey was far from over. Alex had never felt so alive. As he wheeled himself back toward the cabin, the weight of what he had discovered still clung to him like a heavy fog. The wolf's eyes, the pack, the urgency of the forest's cry, it all echoed in his mind, each image searing itself deeper into his soul. But the air around him had shifted. The excitement that had filled him moments before was now tangled with a gnawing doubt. His parents wouldn't understand. He already knew that. The cabin came into view, nestled at the edge of the clearing where the forest met the edge of their small property. The smoke from the chimney was thin, rising lazily into the clear sky. It looked peaceful, untouched by the weight of the world Alex had just encountered. But Alex knew better now. The peace outside wasn't the peace inside. His heart was pounding. As he wheeled up to the porch, his eyes still glazed with the images from the clearing, the howls of the wolves, the silent strength of their pack. He pushed open the door and wheeled himself into the warm light of the cabin, but the comfort of the familiar did little to ease the storm inside him. His mother was standing by the stove, stirring something in a pot, the smell of stew hanging in the air. Her face was soft with concentration, but the moment she looked up at him, she froze. "Alex," she said, her voice low, "where have you been?" Alex didn't respond right away. He was still caught in the moment, his mind replaying the images of the wolves, of the den. He didn't know how to explain it, how to make them see. He opened his mouth to speak, but his father's voice cut him off before the words could leave. "What's that all over you?" His father's voice was stern, cutting through the air like a sharp blade. He was standing at the door now, his expression hard, his eyes flicking over Alex's disheveled appearance. Alex looked down at himself. His clothes were torn in places, covered in dirt and scratches. His hands were trembling, as if the reality of what had happened in the forest had just begun to sink in. But the exhaustion was real, the emotional weight too much for his body to carry. "Are you okay?" His mother's voice softened, her brow furrowing in concern. "You look like you've been out there for days." "I've been to the forest," Alex said, his voice raw, the truth bubbling to the surface. "The wolf, it led me there, to its den. It's not just one wolf. There's a pack, and they're in danger. The whole forest is." His parents exchanged a glance. His father's face hardened, his mouth setting in a tight line. "Alex, what are you talking about? Wild animals can't be trusted. Wolves are dangerous." "What if something happened to you out there?" Alex felt the weight of his father's words press down on him. They weren't understanding. They were afraid. They couldn't see the wolf as anything but a threat. The connection Alex felt, it was invisible to them, a bond that couldn't be explained, only felt. And it was becoming clearer with each passing moment that no matter how hard he tried, they would never understand. "I'm fine," Alex said, trying to keep the panic from his voice. "It's not what you think. The wolf, he's not dangerous. He's trying to show me something. There's something wrong in the forest. The wolves, they need help." But his father stepped forward, his voice low and firm. "This isn't something we're going to discuss. You're going to stay here from now on. No more wandering off into the woods. We've told you 1,000 times, wild animals can't be trusted. They're not like the pets we have here. They're dangerous, Alex." His mother stepped closer, her hand resting on his shoulder. "You don't understand what you're dealing with. Wolves are wild. They're unpredictable." Alex felt his chest tighten. The weight of his parents' fear pressed against him, suffocating him in a way he couldn't explain. It wasn't just fear for his safety. They were afraid of what the wolf represented. They were afraid of the unknown, of the wilderness that existed beyond their doorstep. And in their fear, they were blind to the truth. He didn't want to fight. He didn't want to argue. But the truth was bubbling up inside him, urgent and powerful. "You don't get it," Alex said, his voice cracking with frustration. "I saw it. I saw the wolves. They're struggling. The whole forest is changing. It's not just about me or about the wolves. It's about everything. The balance is breaking, and you're just ignoring it." His mother's eyes filled with worry, but his father's face remained firm, resolute. "Enough," his father said, his tone final. "You're not going back out there, Alex. That's the end of it." The silence that followed was thick, like the air before a storm. Alex's heart beat wildly in his chest. He looked from his father to his mother, feeling the weight of their concern, their misunderstanding. But it wasn't their fault. They couldn't know. They couldn't see what he had seen. His breath came in shallow gasps, but he held his ground, staring at his father, his mother, as if the sheer force of his will could make them understand. "I have to go back," Alex whispered. "I have to. You don't understand, but I do." His parents didn't answer. They just stood there, frozen, staring at him, and in that moment, Alex realized that he was on his own. This was his fight now. The wolf had shown him the truth. It was up to him to protect it, and no matter what they said, no matter how much they feared it, Alex knew there was no turning back. The night was colder than Alex expected. It crept into his bones, numbing him, but not as much as the gnawing feeling in his chest. The forest felt different now, darker, more dangerous. He could sense it in the way the trees swayed, in the eerie stillness that had settled over the land like a thick blanket. The wind was quiet, almost too quiet, and for the first time Alex was unsure of the forest's intentions. He wheeled himself cautiously toward the edge of the woods, the familiar path now unfamiliar in the dark. His heart pounded in his chest. The last few days had been full of uncertainty and tension. The argument with his parents had left him feeling more isolated than ever. They didn't understand. They wouldn't understand. But the wolf, he understood. The wolf had shown him a truth that no one else could see, and now it was time to face it. As he moved deeper into the woods, Alex could feel the presence of the wolf. It wasn't a trick of his mind. It was real, solid, heavy, like the air itself was thick with its watchful gaze. He stopped, listening. There was a shift in the atmosphere, something alert, something waiting. And then, through the trees, he saw them. The pack. Their eyes shone in the darkness, dozens of them, glowing like embers in a dying fire. The pack had arrived, silently emerging from the shadows, their figures just barely visible in the dim light. There were more wolves than Alex had ever seen before. Tall, powerful creatures, moving with the grace of predators, their fur shimmering like dark water. But it was the silence that struck Alex first. The forest had been unnervingly still, but now the pack stood motionless, their eyes locked on him. The wolf, the one he had seen so many times, the one who had led him here, was at the forefront of the pack, its gaze never leaving Alex's face. It wasn't just watching him, it was waiting, and Alex felt it, deep in his chest. A warning, a pull, urgent and sharp, a cry from the wild that resonated in his very soul. He couldn't explain, it couldn't understand it, but he knew. The wolves weren't here by accident. They had come for a reason. The wolf at the front took a step forward, its eyes glowing like twin moons in the dark. Alex could see the tension in its stance, the way it held itself, poised and ready. The pack followed, their bodies shifting, waiting for a sign from their leader. The wolf didn't approach, but it didn't retreat either. It simply stood, the weight of its presence bearing down on Alex. It was then that Alex understood. The wolves weren't here to harm him. They were here to protect something, to protect the land, to protect what was theirs. And something had happened. Something was threatening them, threatening the forest, the balance of everything Alex had come to know. Alex wheeled forward, his breath shallow, his heart racing. He could feel the urgency rising in his chest, the fear, the realization. There was a storm coming, a storm that had nothing to do with the weather, a storm that would tear through the heart of the wilderness, a danger that Alex hadn't fully grasped until now. The pack was here because they had no choice. They had to fight. The wolf looked at him again, its eyes narrowing slightly. And Alex knew this wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something greater, something that transcended them both. The wolf didn't move, but its message was clear. The wilderness was in danger, and the balance was about to be broken. Alex felt the words on his tongue, but before he could speak, the pack began to slip back into the forest as silently as they had arrived. The wolf lingered for just a moment longer, its eyes locked on Alex's. Then, without a sound, it turned and vanished into the darkness, the pack following behind it. Alex was left alone in the woods, his heart hammering in his chest. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, suffocating him. He had to do something. He had to find a way to help. The wolves were warning him, and he couldn't ignore it. Not anymore. But as the last wolf disappeared into the shadows, Alex's mind swirled with a single, urgent thought. It was no longer just about him and the wolf. The stakes were much higher now. He wasn't sure what the danger was, but he knew. One thing, whatever was coming, it was going to change everything. The room was quieter than Alex expected. He stood in front of the podium, his palms clammy and his heart pounding. It felt as though the weight of every pair of eyes in the audience was pressing down on him. The walls of the small auditorium, filled with local conservationists, wildlife enthusiasts, and environmentalists, seemed to close in, their anticipation building with every second of silence. Alex glanced at the paper in his hands, the words he'd written barely legible in his shaking grip. He'd prepared for this moment for weeks, yet now that he was here, his mind was a blur of doubt and nerves. His story, his journey through the forest with the wolf, the bond they had shared, was something that felt so deeply personal, so raw. How could he share it with strangers? How could he make them see what he had felt? How could he make them understand? He took a deep breath, steadying himself, and then he began. "I was 14 when I first saw the wolf," Alex started, his voice shaky at first but growing steadier with each word. "I live in the Montana wilderness, in a small cabin with my parents. We're isolated, far from the closest town. I've always loved the outdoors, but for most of my life I've been confined to a wheelchair. So, nature for me was a dream, something I could only see through a window, something I could only imagine." He paused, glancing at the audience. They were watching him intently, some faces full of sympathy, others with curiosity, but Alex didn't let that distract him. This wasn't about them, it was about the story, his story. "I've always drawn animals. I think it's the closest I'll ever get to truly being a part of the wilderness." He swallowed, the lump in his throat thickening. But then one evening, everything changed. My wheelchair rolled into the forest, almost as if it was guided by an invisible hand. I didn't understand it then, but I saw the wolf. There was a soft murmur from the crowd. Alex could feel their attention sharpen. He pressed on, his words beginning to flow more easily now. The wolf wasn't just some wild animal. It didn't run in fear. It stood there, in the shadows, watching me. And I knew there was something more to it. A connection I couldn't explain. Something ancient, something deeper than just instinct or fear. Alex paused again, letting the words sink in, feeling the weight of his experience. He could see it now, like a dream just beyond reach. The wolf standing in front of him, its eyes filled with intelligence and something else, something like understanding. He had felt it then, that bond between them, and it was as real as the air he breathed. The wolf led me into the forest, deeper than I had ever gone before, Alex continued, his voice stronger now, more confident. It wasn't just about seeing the beauty of the land. It was about understanding something about survival, about resilience. The wolf wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. And I realized that's what it was trying to show me, not just the wilderness, but a way of life, a way of overcoming the obstacles that life throws at you, no matter how impossible they may seem. He paused, his eyes scanning the faces of the audience, feeling a wave of emotion wash over him. His hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the podium, but he didn't let himself stop. For weeks, I kept seeing the wolf. It followed me through the forest and I began to draw it, not just its image, but its spirit, the way it moved through the trees, the way it existed in the wild. And slowly, I began to understand something about myself. The wolf, it was more than just a creature. It was a symbol of something I needed to learn, something I didn't know I was missing. The wolf taught me how to trust again, how to believe in my own strength. It showed me that no matter how alone you feel, you're never truly alone. Alex's voice broke slightly as he spoke the last words, but he didn't care. He didn't need to hide anymore, not from the people in this room, and certainly not from himself. The wolf didn't just teach me to survive," he finished, his voice steady now, resonating with the conviction he had carried through all of his encounters with the animal. "It taught me to respect the wild, to understand that nature isn't something we can take for granted, something we can destroy and rebuild at will. It's something fragile, something worth protecting. That's what I've come to realize. And that's why I'm here today, to tell you that the wilderness is worth saving. The wolves, the land, the balance, they need us. We need to protect them." For a long moment, silence filled the room. Alex stood still, waiting for some sign, some reaction. But he didn't need it. The words had left his mouth, and now they hung in the air like a tangible truth. Then, one by one, the audience stood. A soft applause began, hesitant at first, but then growing louder, more powerful. Alex felt his heart soar, his chest tightening with emotion. He wasn't just speaking for himself anymore. He was speaking for the wolf, for the wilderness, for everything he had learned. And in that moment, he knew that his story had found its place in the world. Alex sat by the window of the cabin, his gaze drifting over the landscape he had come to know so intimately. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their branches whispering secrets only the wind could understand. The mountains loomed in the distance, vast and silent, their snow-capped peaks a reminder of the untamed wild that surrounded him. It had been months since the wolf had disappeared from his life. It was as if the creature had slipped back into the shadows of the forest, leaving behind only memories that burned in Alex's mind with a vividness that refused to fade. The wolf had taught him so much, shown him a side of himself he never knew existed. It had given him the strength to face the world outside the cabin, to embrace life even when it felt like everything was against him. But now, as Alex sat there, alone with his thoughts, he realized that the lessons the wolf had imparted were not ones he could easily forget. They had become a part of him, woven into the fabric of his being. He drew the wolf often now, not just as a way of remembering, but as a reminder of the bond they had shared, the bond that transcended words, transcended barriers. His sketches had changed. They weren't just about capturing the likeness of the wolf anymore. They were about capturing its spirit, the essence of what it meant to be part of the wild. His drawings had become his way of honoring the creature that had shown him what it meant to be free, to be strong, to be resilient. And now he drew not just for himself, but for the world that needed to understand. One evening after dinner, Alex wheeled himself out to the edge of the forest as he often did. The air was cool, and the sky had turned a deep, dusky blue, the stars beginning to pierce the darkening canvas of the heavens. He paused, his fingers gripping the rims of his wheels, and looked out into the trees. There was a peace in the stillness, a quiet that seemed to echo the memories of his encounters with the wolf. As he sat there, he felt it, a presence, a weight in the air that wasn't quite of this world. He turned his head slowly, scanning. The woods. The wind rustled the leaves, but there was something else, something subtle in the way the trees seemed to sway in a rhythm that felt familiar. And then, as if from the shadows themselves, a shape emerged, a figure moving silently. Between the trunks, it was there, just beyond the clearing, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. The wolf. Alex's heart skipped a beat. He knew it immediately, despite the time that had passed. The wolf had returned. It stood there, its coat a dark silhouette against the backdrop of the night. Its eyes locked onto Alex's, the same intelligent gaze that had once felt like a quiet understanding. The connection between them, though not spoken aloud, was as strong as it had ever been. The wolf didn't approach, but it didn't retreat either. It simply watched, as though waiting for something. Alex felt a surge of emotion, a bittersweet longing for the days when they had shared the forest together. But something had changed. He had changed. He had come to understand the lessons the wolf had given him, and now, in the stillness of the night, he understood something else. The journey wasn't over, it had only just begun. He wheeled himself forward, slowly, cautiously, but with a newfound confidence. The wolf remained where it stood, observing him with a quiet patience. Alex could feel the weight of its gaze, but now, instead of fear or uncertainty, there was only trust. He had learned that the bond they shared was not something that could be undone, not something that could be taken away. When Alex reached the edge of the clearing, he stopped. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The wolf's eyes told him everything. It was a look that spoke of survival, of resilience, of the wild and untamed beauty of the world they both loved. It was a look that told him that his journey, his connection to the wilderness, was not just about one animal or one moment. It was about something bigger. It was about the quiet strength of nature, the power of trust, and the responsibility that came with understanding it. As the wolf turned and disappeared into the shadows, Alex remained at the edge of the forest, his heart full, his mind clear. He knew that the wolf was out there, somewhere continuing its journey. But Alex's journey wasn't over either. His path now lay ahead of him, not just as a survivor, but as someone who understood that the true power of life, the true power of nature, came not from conquering it, but from respecting it, from learning from it. And so, as the stars began to fill the sky, Alex whispered a quiet thank you to the wolf for everything, for the lessons, for the strength, for the bond that would never fade, no matter how far apart they were. With a final glance at the forest, Alex wheeled himself back toward the cabin, his heart light, his spirit unbroken. The wild would always be with him, and he would always carry its lessons in his heart. He had learned what it meant to trust, to survive, and to protect, and in that, he had found his purpose. The story of the wolf was no longer just a memory. It was a legacy of trust,